Well, for more analysis on the war in Ukraine, we're joined by Samuel Ramani, Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you very much for speaking to us on France 24. I want to start with a recent article that you wrote for The Telegraph. You argue that time is on Ukraine's side. Why?
Well, I think that people are making a misinterpretation when they basically say that the longer the negotiations take and the more the stalling that happens, the more it benefits Russia. Because actually, we're starting to see some tides turn on the battlefield. We've already seen 300 square kilometers of territory be liberated by the Ukrainians, mostly on the southern front line around Zaporizhia. That's significantly more than what Russia captured during the entirety of December of 2025. We're seeing the Russians losing access to Starlink and that affecting their communication systems. Moreover, we're seeing new technologies enter the Ukrainian uh, or military, like the Lynx tanks that are coming from Rheinmetall in Germany, which are quite significant, and just other statistics, like the 1.3 million Russians who have been killed or injured in this war. Manpower recruitment is falling behind casualties for 2 months consecutive, to the point at which Russia needs foreign fighters. And then there's the war economy bubble bursting. So I think that there's lots of factors that could lead to Ukraine gaining some more advantages. I don't mean that Ukraine can win the war and can kick the Russians out of Donbass and Crimea or anything like that, but I mean that the longer duration doesn't necessarily fall into Russia's favor, and Russia can't really outlast the West like I think it can.
Well, what about the Russians? I mean, aren't they also using FPV drones? Aren't they also, you mentioned the faltering access to Starlink, but some believe that Russia will find a workaround for that. So, uh, you know, how close is it? Is what's to put Ukraine ahead?
Well, yeah, the Russians definitely have significant breakthroughs that they've undergone with FPVs. That's why it's very important that the counter drone technologies continue to sharpen. So, for example, the Ukrainians are doing some cutting edge investments in drone to drone interceptions, which don't require expensive missiles to occur. We should also be watching some foreign backed equipment like the Sky Rangers coming in that could actually shoot these drones out. They got 35 millimeter cannons, which are good at dealing with drones, more effective than missiles. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a battle between the quality of the FPV drones and Russia's scalability of Iranian model drones, which they seem to be doing quite well on, and Ukraine's ability to create cheaper, mass-produced counter drone defense systems. There's a very vibrant startup culture inside Ukraine, getting foreign investments, dealing with indigenous technology. And it's really a battle between indigenous innovations on both sides to determine who has an edge in the drone war.
Well, as you alluded to, data point to unsustainable losses for Moscow. Some 1.3 million Russians either have been wounded or killed since the start of the war. But how big of a deal is this when both sides are relying so heavily on drone warfare?
Well, I mean, I think it's quite significant, obviously, because this is fundamentally now a war of attrition, right? There's immense numbers of people dying for a territory that's extremely small. I mean, the rate of attrition for the Russians is higher than the Battle of Somme during World War One, which is kind of seen as the benchmark of attritional warfare in Europe for about a century now. So, obviously, drones are really what's going to be deciding what's happening on the battlefield. I think even more than the quantity of tanks and to some extent the quantity of ammunition and artillery. Though obviously European supply chains do seem to be a little bit more vulnerable in that regard compared to what Russia can source domestically and from its partners like North Korea. But ultimately, yeah, manpower is critical. Ukraine's got manpower problems too. 600,000 men have fled the war zone. They're struggling to find recruitments. They're increasing the conscription age to 60. But Russia's manpower problems are maybe even more acute in some cases, just simply because they're losing as an offensive force significantly more people for every Ukrainian soldier.
So, militarily speaking, what could give Ukraine a decisive edge? Is maintaining the flow of Western weapons and ammunition enough?
I mean, definitely maintaining the flow of ammunition and weapons is enough. Definitely new IFVs and new artillery, like I mentioned, the links, things of that variety can be good. Investing as heavily as possible in indigenous defense technologies, especially in the drone space, as well as in any kind of analogs the Ukrainians might be producing as an alternative to Starlink as well, which might create some more unpredictabilities for the Russians in the communication space, especially if the Russians are developing their own sorts of communications. Uh, there's lots of ways the West can help Ukraine, and moreover, I think there needs to be a pairing of that with significant amounts of development assistance, as well as assistance to repair Ukraine's energy grids and energy infrastructure. We already were seeing some delays and some quickly coming from here in Britain with regards to that, which have been quite concerning. And Britain slashing, for example, its ODA budget to while at the same time increasing defense spending. There needs to be a whole of kind of conflict approach. So you're not just supplying weapons on the ground, but you're also ensuring that the infrastructure to manufacture those weapons domestically and the infrastructure that's needed to keep the morale high at home is there. So it needs to be a holistic support for Ukraine economically and militarily.
Well, for all its weaknesses, Russia has been unwilling to compromise on key issues like territory in these peace negotiations. What do you think is the strategy here, especially if, as you say, time is on Ukraine's side?
Well, Russia doesn't see it that way, obviously, and Russia believes that it can outlast the West, that eventually the West is going to get tired. Trump is going to get impatient, blame Zelensky for not making territorial concessions, and Europe is not going to be able to have enough cars or enough weapons to be able to take the US's place. And then the Russians will be able to grind to a victory in Donbass, potentially take over parts of Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. So the Russians are still gambling on the fact that Western resolve is going to falter and that they can outlast and win. That's been the idea that they've had ever since the start of the war, and that's not changing. I don't think that that's necessarily grounded in empirics, but it's deeply ingrained in the Russian military and collective psyche, and definitely deeply ingrained in how Putin views the world. Putin still sees the West as fundamentally weak after the inadequate responses to the 2008 war in Georgia, 2014 annexation of Crimea, is the war crimes in Syria, and also some of the initial escalation risk concerns and early delays in weapons deliveries in 2022. And he believes that ultimately Russia will outlast the West. So it's not necessarily a fully empirical calculation. I think it's just a deeply rooted belief that is very hard to shake, and that leads to Russia being very intransigent at the diplomatic table.
All right, Samuel Ramani from the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you very much